This conference will now be recorded.
Yes, Nick, we can see your screen. Everything looks good.
Okay. Just kind of starting off, there's the old trick for speakers to relax in terms of imagining their audience is just in their underwear. And so I'd like to turn the tables today and just encourage you to imagine that I'm giving this talk in my underwear. So, okay, to start off here, I dug up an old slide from a Far Side cartoon about, the committee to decide whether spawning should be taught in school. It turns out maybe the cod in the Gulf of Alaska should have taken that to heart because they're in pretty bad shape. And in fact, that fishery was virtually closed. There was a small fishery opened up just for local fishers. But this this event has kind of motivated this study that I'm going to briefly review here today. As part of that, this brief review, I'm going to touch on a little bit about what has happened recently in terms of the warm temperatures in the Gulf of Alaska versus the blob of 2014, 15 into 16. A little bit on the biological responses, maybe probably focus more on the mechanisms, and just a couple of recent tidbits about predicting these kinds of events. I'd like to recognize the contributions by Phyllis Stabenow and on the physics part, and especially for some of the stuff I'm going to be showing here right away, Dave Kimball and Allison Deary's some of their results. Dave has presented some of this at a previous EcoFoci seminar, but I'm going to present it again. So, first of all, let me, one thing I'd like to know. I'm not sure if the little GoToMeeting control panel is covering this part of the screen, but anyway, I'll leave it go. Just taking a look at a series of maps for the progression of the sea surface temperature anomalies during the big event, the blob of 2014 into 2016 versus the more recent one. You can see by kind of the late summer of 2019, from a sea surface temperature anomaly perspective, it was every bit as warm as it was late in the summer of 2014. They did get started at different times of year. The original blob really revved up in the winter of 13-14, while the more recent one, for most of its geographic extent, was more really developed in the summer of 2019. So we kind of expect that those events are going to, have different kinds of structures and so forth. And more about that in a few minutes. So the stuff I'm going to be presenting today, just again, I've cannibalized some slides that Dave Kimball put together, mostly from the larval groundfish assessments that have been done over the years. I'm going to be doing a lot about looking at the ocean temperatures, and in particular subsurface temperatures, and there go down to the third point, mostly relying on ocean reanalysis type data, and particularly that from the NOAA GODAS product. I have done some comparisons with the more direct measurements from the Argo profiling network. And then at the very end, I'm going to be talking about some predictions. So here we go. So first of all, again, what was happening out there? There's some direct measurements at depth, not really deep, but certainly below the surface, 50 to 100 meters, showing the temperatures in the years of 2013 through 2019, the little postage stamp maps to the right. The redder colors show warmer temperatures. And you can see that 2019, along with 2015, were quite warm years. 2013 was on the cool side. 2017 was kind of more in the middle. Along with those warm temperatures
I
in
kind of liked in over the wall.
say again, sorry.
I kind of liked the mermaid's bite. It's like
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get that question.
Everyone should be muted now, Nick. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, and feel free to interrupt. You know, we're all, you know, getting through this. All right. So in terms of what was out there, you know, from a biological point of view, these three plots show time series, generally every 2 years, of spring zooplankton numbers. And in the upper left, small copepods, lower left, large copepods, lower right, euphausiids. Again, this is spring. And can see that especially for the large copepods and euphausiids especially, that the numbers during the warm years of 2015 and 2019 were very much reduced in the spring. I don't have a plot, but my understanding is there was some recovery in the summer. But anyway, going into the warm season, it certainly wasn't good for those higher predators that are looking for large copepods and euphausiids as prey. In terms of what the larval assessments we're finding in terms of groundfish larvae, that is, the maps on the left show for walleye pollock in the 4 different years, 2013, 15, 17, and 2019, what the distributions of the catches were. The red dots showing where there were no larvae, walleye pollock in this case, in that particular tow, and small blue circles where it was just relatively limited numbers. The time series at the right show kind of overall abundances, and with the Pacific cod being the in the left column, the middle one showing both 2015 and 2019 very low numbers. 2017 some recovery, but certainly nothing like it was in the 1990s and most of the 2000s. And so this is why there was so much concern, and what I think makes it interesting to look about how it got warm there. Before I really get started there, I would like to point out some work that was carried out by the FOSI group a few years ago. And here to emphasize that groundfish aren't necessarily near the surface. You know, given their name, maybe that's not a huge surprise. The larval fish tend to be higher up in the water column, but the larger fish down lower. And it is, this plot's kind of confusing, but what it shows is how those fish in the past, and this is in particular Pacific cod, respond to temperatures in their environment. And especially the bigger fish, which are indicated by the larger dots in this plot, tend to, when it's warm, they tend to move lower into the water column, and when it's cooler, up into the water column. And that, so when you separate the, you know, kind of the cold periods with the blue dots, the kind of more neutral temperatures, the black dots, and the warm periods, the red dots, you can see that there's definitely some vertical migration that was directly observed with the trawl surveys there. And so the fish care what's happening in their environment below the surface. All right, so it was, again, the idea is, just how warm was it there at depth, and how did it get that way? And what I'm showing here are 3 plots showing, I picked the layer from 100 to 250 meters below the surface. That's kind of arbitrary as one to mostly focus on. And what I'm showing is for the year ending last summer, what the temperature distribution was at that for that layer across, the Gulf of Alaska. The GODAS and Hadley maps show 2 different ocean reanalyses that it's easy to get their data in near real time. And the bottom map shows from the gridded product from the Argo project, directly measured temperatures. One of the problems with the Argo data set is it's mostly a blue water sort of product, and so it can't really get close enough to places like Kodiak Island where we really care about what the conditions are like, and that's where the cod are hanging out. And so have done some comparisons between Argo and these ocean reanalyses, and they're mostly favorable comparisons, but again, relying again on the ocean reanalyses because they are giving us the data where we need it. And here, one of the other things I've been doing is comparing the analyses to one another. And this is actually just a climatology of the mean September temperatures. And these comparisons I have found to be heartening in that they seem to be kind of all on the same page, with admittedly some differences between them. Different products have different resolutions, maybe have a little bit more mesoscale variability than other ones, but they're for the most part telling the same story. Okay, so it was warm, really warm in 2019 in in the place that's of special interest here, what I've sometimes called the Central Gulf of Alaska, sometimes West Central Gulf of Alaska. This is just southeast of Kodiak Island, basically along the shelf break there, extending a little bit into deeper water. The time series in red on the upper left shows just the temperatures there from the GODAS product back to 1980 through September 2019. And what I think is really interesting, of course, is that 2019 at these depths was actually considerably warmer than 2015 into 16. And that there's this kind of slow oscillation in temperatures in that region. It was also quite warm there around 2000, and kind of a spike, even warmer temperatures in the early 1980s, again, according to GODAS. And that time series at depth doesn't much resemble the PDO that is that's shown in the lower right, that is often used to characterize the North Pacific ocean conditions. And so if you want to know what's going on at depth, you'd be well advised to be careful about using some of these favorite indices we have for characterizing the state of that system. Just to kind of reinforce that point here, I've just plotted depth profiles, again, from that box of interest southeast of Kodiak Island. There's 2015 in black, 2019 in red, and you can see, it's maybe a little warmer near the surface at 2015 overall, but it was considerably warmer at depth in 2019. The idea that it was warmer at depth actually shouldn't come as too great a surprise. We know as a kind of a hangover from the blob of 2014-16 that a lot of that warm water that developed in the Northeast Pacific, eventually some of that heat worked down into the 100 to 300 meter layer. These just show some plots excerpted from this this monthly ocean briefing that NOAA CPC holds, and so you can see that the really warm temperatures there, 2015 into 2016, but when the surface recovered, there was still this warm water kind of at depth. And in terms of kind of figuring out what's happening at Kodiak Island, it's worth considering the mean circulation here in the area of interest. Now, I know most of you are probably familiar with the mean currents, but people are born every day that don't know about this. And so just to review, there's a counterclockwise circulation around the Gulf of Alaska. In the middle of the Gulf, a very slow poleward flow to the water, a more concentrated currents, kind of off the shelf break, the Alaska current, and it especially picks up the Alaskan stream in the western part of the basin. And here, just to give away a punchline, essentially kind of conditions that are in the eastern part of the basin will be kind of transported into the region off of Kodiak Island there without much delay because of this circulation. As part of that circulation, another thing to keep in mind is that the flow isn't exactly horizontal. It turns out in that not strictly, but for the most part, the flow follows along density surfaces, isopycnals. And here for the Gulf of Alaska, those isopycnals are more depressed in the east, off the BC and southeast Alaska, and they're higher in the water column in the west off of Kodiak Island. That tilt is mostly due to the temperature. So it's especially warm in the east and cooler in the west, and so saltier in the east and fresher in the west. And so this is the the kind of overall oceanography. Another way to look at that, and this is just from Argo direct data. If you look at the depth of this constant density surface that the flow mostly goes along, it is much deeper, the kind of yellow-red colors there in the eastern part of the basin, and it shoals as the water moves counterclockwise around towards Kodiak Island. So that's the depth on the isopycnal. Another way to look at that is just what, for a particular depth, in this case 250 meters, what the density is with the kind of redder colors actually showing higher density. And so it's kind of lower density water in the east and higher density water in the west. And so that water, as it circulates around, cools off and freshens as it goes. All right. Oh, I want to go back here. So I gave away something there. So the idea that with warmer water in the east, perhaps one way you could get it warmer in the west is just have a stronger gyre circulation there. Have faster transport of water into that region off of Kodiak Island. And if you actually look again from the GODAS reanalysis about what the flow was like in the year or so leading up to this, those really warm conditions, it's just the opposite signal that the flow anomalies here is what's plotted. It was actually a reduced cyclonic or clockwise circulation around the Gulf of Alaska. It was still going in the same sense, but it was just slower than usual. And so it wasn't that the currents were stronger, they were weaker. But what instead, if you concentrate on that rectangle that I plot there in the right, was what conditions were like there, the thermodynamic properties of the water in that region that eventually did get over to Kodiak Island. And there, and this might be kind of confusing, but I put it in kind of sort of maybe a weird sort of clock form in terms of the progression of what the temperatures were like in the Northeast Pacific. So it starts off, the clock starts off in the upper right and goes to lower right and then lower left and then upper left. And so starting in the winter of 1718, it was, and this is all for the 100 to 250 meter layer, it was somewhat warmer than, quite a bit warmer than normal in the eastern Gulf of Alaska, just near Haida Gwaii, the Alexander Archipelago, there, off of Sitka and so forth. It actually was a little bit lesser there through the summer of 2018, but then in the winter of 2018-19, it really warmed up in that region there, again, near that box that I've highlighted. And then over the course of 2019, from GODAS at least, there's the indication that warm water was, much of it was advected with the mean circulation around to the Kodiak Island. So now I'm going to go back here and note that in that rectangle there off of in the eastern Gulf of Alaska, the anomalous flow was directed offshore. And it was also in that region, again from GODAS, and this part of the ocean reanalysis I don't fully trust, but it indicates that there was also anomalous downward motion in that region. And so the circulation, the dynamics, for whatever reason, were causing, at least in this, according to this ocean reanalysis, an offshore directed and downward flow relative to normal of water that is generally warm near the coast and at shallower depths. And so that's kind of illustrated with this diagram, this vertical cross section in the same place, that relative to normal, there was kind of a transport of this warmer water from near the coast and at shallower depths into the region of the kind of near the, well, the starting point of the Alaska current. All right, so what could have caused that? Well, there was, during the winter of 2018-19, there was a very strong ridge of anomalous high pressure in that region. And that would tend to, just from an Ekman pumping point of view, and just would tend to promote downward motion in the ocean, and conceivably also an considering the kind of anti-clockwise circulation around these anomalies, transport of waters offshore. Okay, so just to get back, I want to go back to this plot here. There's pretty strong evidence that at least the precursor conditions for the warming in the central western Gulf of Alaska were preceded something like 9 months or so, 6 to 9 months ahead by warm waters in the eastern Gulf of Alaska. And so the idea is, can we predict this sort of thing? And so what I've just done in the last few days, actually, is gone in and looked at the subsurface temperature predictions from the model that's used by NOAA for seasonal weather prediction. And what it was showing, the real-time version of that, of what the temperatures were, the forecasts made on March 1 for September temperatures from that product for my box off the Kodiak Island, and that's the orange trace there. The actual temperatures, again, if we trust the GODAS product to say what they are, is the blue trace with the big blue squares, and the correspondence there between the actual temperatures and the forecast temperatures is okay. The linear correlation coefficient between the two is 0.6 or something like that. There's not very many points to make a correlation about. If you just take what the temperatures are in the eastern part of the Gulf and shift them, accounting for the cooling that always goes on as the water moves from the eastern Gulf to the western Gulf, then you get maybe even a stronger correspondence with what the actual observed temperatures were. And so, again, from both these kinds of things, it gives some strong evidence, I would say, that we can forecast what's happening in the western Gulf with at least, maybe 6 to 9 months lead time. I've done the same sort of thing and used the whole GODAS temperature record, and going back to 1980 to do the same sort of thing. Here, for what it's worth, I've used 3-month running means and kind of taking into account the shoaling of the isopycnal in that circulation. And so here, just in the what we're trying to predict is the blue trace there with the blue squares, what the temperatures are like in the west central Gulf of Alaska. And here, just looking at the mean temperatures in the eastern Gulf preceding that. You can judge for yourself how good a correspondence this is. Clearly, on longer time scales, they're going to track one another, and that should be the case. In terms of the kind of interannual variations, not bad. It's not a perfect forecast. There's other things that are going on. But I think, again, it gives some kind of support to the idea of forecasting for our cod stocks, perhaps. One last thing, and I just did this morning. You can see it's kind of such an ugly plot. This is kind of for Steve Barbeau's benefit. I don't know if he's on. If not, may God have mercy on his soul, whatever. But here he has talked about how the cod in the Gulf of Alaska have had some really big swings in their abundance over long time scales. And if I remember correctly, around 1940, there was some real low population estimates. And for what it's worth, here from a different ocean reanalysis product that actually goes back a long ways, you can see that 1940 was a period off of Kodiak Island in which it was very warm. And whether this is a coincidence or not, who can say? All right, so my just last remarks. We had a marine heat wave again in 2019 in the Gulf of Alaska. I think it was especially noteworthy because of what was happening below the surface, and that it was actually quite a bit warmer in this 100 to 250 meter layer in 2019 than it was during the blob that got so much attention. And I would say there's pretty strong evidence that in general, warm water in that region is preceded by warm water in the eastern Gulf of Alaska, which just makes sense given the mean circulation. And that my last point there, that perhaps we actually have some predictability in these kinds of events. And so with that, I'll close, and let's see. I see some things coming up in the chat box, and I'll let Heather run the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm gonna just clap from my laptop for you, for everybody here. Okay, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. There are 110 of you online.
Oh my.
I know. So, and it's so good to see some of you from our lab tuning in as well, and all of you who are not from the lab. While I wait for some questions to be typed in, if you also just want to ask yourself, I will do my best to unmute you. So if you just sort of like raise your hand in some way, just let me know that you have a question in the chat, then I will try to navigate that, just because I know it might be nice to hear some voices. Thank you all again for joining us for our remote seminar. Thank you, Nick, for doing this today for us. I know this is not the normal. And also remember that this is the first of the next 5 weeks of seminars that we have. We do have one break week in between. And then if you guys do check out the One NOAA Science Seminar listing, or also the NOAA PMEL website for a list of the upcoming seminars as well. Oh yeah, sorry, Jens, thank you for that reminder. Jens reminded me that Matt had a question earlier on with one of your first slides, and it was that were the error bars for variation for within season or among location? And it was your third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. The next, your arrow's on one slide, but the next slide, Nick, is it where he was asking that question?
Yes. Yeah, there. I'm going to have to defer to Dave Kimmel. I'm not sure if he's on the phone. But
I don't see him listed, but Dave, if you're just a caller without a name, please go ahead and let me know if you're here.
yeah, now I know that at least the last year's 2019 estimates are based on just some estimates made, not complete counts necessarily. And then I think those abundances, the error bars there may have to do something with the kind of just the way the sampling is done, that it's not quite the same sampling each year, and so there's some uncertainty. You're not covering each point.
Nick, is this the, I can't quite see the figure. I think it's the larval data.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was about the error bars. And I think we sample, normally it's spring data sampled in sort of a pretty set window in April, May. And then it's a core area that's sampled. So it's simply, I think, the variation is sort of for these samples within each year, there's data sampled across sort of a finite space. So there are multiple vertical toes of fish, or toes of fish larvae. And then the red dot in 2019 is from what we call rapid assessments. So these are done on the boat, and then later they will be verified, you know, as we go through the samples. I think that's how it is. And
right. That's my understanding too, and you stated it more articulately. So thanks.
Thanks, Jan, for that as well. Okay, so Mike Alexander had a question. Can you see month-to-month propagation of the anomalies from the east to Kodiak Island, perhaps along an isopycnal?
I have to admit I haven't really checked that, and that would be a meaningful thing to do. And to the extent that I don't want to get into the weeds here, but these ocean reanalyses are they aren't necessarily dynamically consistent from month to month, and then they get new data and then have to kind of adjust things. And so that's a good idea to do that sort of thing. What I have done in many cases is done some kind of averaging over kind of larger areas and time scales of like 3 months or so to try to minimize the impacts of eddy activity and how they're influencing conditions as diagnosed, because they could really be aliasing some of the results we're seeing. And in other words, in some cases, an ocean reanalysis may be picking up the effects of the eddy 1 month and not the next month, and it could be kind of a mess. But he's exactly right, as usual, that would be a very good thing to do.
Great. And we do have another question from Chris Meinig. And Chris asks, what tools do the community need to better monitor and predict marine heat waves? Have we identified gaps?
Yeah, I would say that because a lot of the fish are on the shelf, that we need in the North Pacific, we need more assets, whether it's gliders or I'm not sure the best way to do this, but on the shelf. Argo is doing a great job, at least on kind of longer time scales, of monitoring the blue ocean. And what we need is to be able to see is in fact, we had warming up along the shelf break there in the eastern Gulf of Alaska, because if it is, we can be pretty sure that water is going to get to places where there are important commercial fisheries.
So that's the last question I have on the chat. Does anybody else have more questions for Nick? Nick, anything else that you want to talk about while you have people here?
Well, I saw a comment from Ned Copeland, and I did kind of misspeak about just the nature of the bottom trawl surveys, and essentially what just to be set the record straight, that study that did Yang et al. The temperatures there were based on bottom trawl surveys, and the fish didn't actually move up and down the water column. They moved to near the bottom to shallower and deeper. And all along in this work, I've kind of tacitly assumed that the places that I'm looking at that are kind of near the shelf break are kind of reflecting some of the waters that are getting on to the outer shelf where some of these fish hang out. But there's a little bit of an article of faith there. And so, yeah, again, we have to be, and I keep remind myself to be careful there in using some of these products that are out there, because not strictly looking at the same thing as where the fish really are. So thanks for bringing that up.
Great. Any other questions from folks online? Give you a minute to type them in.
And now that we're finishing up, I have a chance to actually put clothes on and get out of my, not just be in my underwear, right?
Thanks for that image, Nick. Appreciate that. All right, it doesn't seem like we have any more questions online, and folks are starting to sign off. So Nick, again, thank you so much for doing this today. I'm sorry that it had to be virtual, but I think it went pretty well. And then hopefully we see all of you next week.
Yeah, and next time I get cookies, right?
Sure, just for you.
Yeah, there we go. All right, thanks everybody.
All right, thank you everybody.